This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. Today's episode of Curious Minnesota is sponsored by Primrose Schools. Before we begin today's show, I just want to let you know there are some big things happening right now at the Minnesota Star Tribune. That's right, the Minnesota Star Tribune. We've actually just changed our name, which is part of a larger transformation of this company. We've recently restructured our coverage areas and added more reporters in greater Minnesota. You'll find that both StarTribune.com and our smartphone apps have been rebuilt. Our opinion coverage now features a greater diversity of voices. In fact, it's now called Strib Voices. And the company has rolled out an entirely new brand to reflect these and other changes that are going on. So if there was ever a time to get a digital subscription, that time is now. We've got some new pricing options too. In fact, new digital subscribers can get 6 months of the Minnesota Star Tribune for $1. $1. So check out the new website at StarTribune.com, and you can subscribe at StarTribune.com/subscribe. Okay, on to the show. You can tell a little bit about a state's identity by the words featured on its license plates. Florida, for example, calls itself the Sunshine State. Arizona is the Grand Canyon State. Maine is Vacation Land. And Wisconsin is America's Dairyland. In Minnesota, our license plates say simply 10,000 lakes, a reference to our nickname, the land of 10,000 lakes. We have a great deal of pride in our lakes. People who pick up Land O'Lakes butter in grocery stores across the country probably don't realize it, but that's about Minnesota. So I was surprised to learn that at least some people in Wisconsin think their state has more lakes than Minnesota. It's because there's not one standard for what defines a lake. A reader wanted to know why the states are measuring their lakes differently. And joining me today is Erica Pearson, who dug into this question for Curious Minnesota. Well, Erica, thanks so much for joining us today. So, first of all, you're going to be helping with Curious, and so people may be hearing more from you.
I am. Yeah. Hi, everybody.
Welcome. All right, so you are from Wisconsin originally, so maybe I'm answering my own question here, but what drew you to this particular question?
Well, growing up in Burnett County, which is a beautiful area full of lakes, lots of Minnesotans like to vacation there.
This is our pro-Wisconsin comments because we're going to spend some time saying other things about Wisconsin.
Yeah. I grew up understanding that Wisconsin actually had more lakes. It was just that Minnesota liked to brag about theirs a lot more.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So Wisconsin really feels somewhat superior in this way. I didn't realize this, but some people, at least in Wisconsin.
Wrongly, it turns out, but yes.
Okay. So, and the claim in Wisconsin is basically what? I mean, as far as how many lakes?
So Wisconsin, and the DNR puts this on their website, Wisconsin claims 15,000 lakes.
Wow. Okay. Why is there some discrepancy? Because we have 10,000, but it's actually a bit of a higher number than that. But why is there a discrepancy between these numbers?
It turns out that Wisconsin is counting much, much smaller bodies of water, ponds, essentially, to get that number.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this sort of fuels jokes sometimes, online jokes.
It does. I took a look on Reddit and I found a commenter on a Reddit thread made one that is pretty typical. Here's a quote. "Sometimes I take a leak out behind my garage and it forms a puddle. If I was in Wisconsin, I could call it a lake."
Wow. Okay. And we debated whether that was I was like, is this too vulgar? And then everybody was like, I love that. I mean, you probably got a lot of good feedback about that quote.
I did. It brings it home though.
Oh,
you know. Yeah.
It's a fun joke.
Yeah.
Okay. And so this is bigger than just this little border rivalry we're talking about. I mean, this question about what is a lake sort of has bigger, wider implications.
Yes, everywhere around the world, there is no single standard, like a universal scientific definition to determine between a lake and a pond.
And does that matter?
Well, creates confusion. See Wisconsin, Minnesota, but anywhere. Actually, in 2022, an article in the journal Scientific Reports included a plea by a group of scientists for a standard because of all the confusion it causes.
Interesting. Okay. So let's sort of just get these numbers out there. So, Minnesota's land of 10,000 lakes, that's just sort of a name. We're going to talk about that in a second. But what is the actual number of lakes in Minnesota if we go by this 10-acre definition, which we're also going to talk about why we have a 10-acre definition. But what is the number?
So it turns out it's even more than 10,000. It is more than 14,000, just over 14,000.
Okay, so you hear that, listeners? If you're out on your pontoon boat or whatever, and you got to talk about how many lakes do we have, it's more than 14,000 lakes. And if we take the same metric and apply it to Wisconsin, this 10-acre standard, where do we end up?
So they have just over 6,000.
Okay, and that comes from PolitiFact.
It does.
We'll explain in a second why PolitiFact got involved in this. But all right, so if you're having cocktails by the cabin, or maybe if you're in Wisconsin or something, and you need to remember the numbers, it's more than 14,000 Minnesota lakes and a little over 6,000 Wisconsin lakes using the 10-acre standard.
Yes.
All right, let's just establish that. All right. Let's go into our chronology. So Minnesota, land of 10,000 lakes, where'd that come from?
Well, we can trace it all the way back to 1874. That's when it first appeared in print. And it happened at the state fair. A professor named Ransom Humiston gave a speech at the state fair about what he called Minnesota's glorious future.
Okay, and I'm gonna read a bit here just because it's very old-timey and fun and very boosterism. We may justly claim that we are the hub of North America. We have 38 rivers in the state, 6 of which are navigable within the state, amounting to an aggregate of about 1,200 miles. Then come over 10,000 lakes, abounding in delicious fish and the paradise of myriads of waterfowl. So really over the top, fun old speech. But this is an important speech in this context, it sounds like.
Yeah, myriads of waterfowl.
Yeah. Okay, so that was in 1874, but the state really didn't have any nickname. So where do we go next?
Well, we almost got another nickname. We were almost the bread and butter state.
Okay. What do you mean almost?
Back in 1901 at a World's Fair in Buffalo, there was a whole pamphlet calling us that, and it does make sense.
Yeah, right, because we were producing a lot of flour and also producing a lot of butter, number one butter state in the country by 1920, so anyway, yeah, that totally makes sense. So Pan American Expo, the World Exposition in 1901, we were the bread and butter state on this pamphlet. Okay, that doesn't really take hold. And then where do we go next?
So in 1917, the idea of automobile tourism was starting to really take off, and Minnesota wanted to be a part of it. Boosters put ads in newspapers in places like Kansas City. I'll read one of them. It's kind of fun. 10,000 Minnesota lakes are calling you. Come up and play. We're at springtime all the summer long.
Wow. Okay. You have some family in Missouri. What does it mean to tell someone in Missouri that Minnesota is springtime all the summer long?
Well, it can be unbearably hot, unbearably muggy.
Oh, okay.
And
so it's very humid there.
Yes. So I can imagine how it would feel like springtime in the summer up here.
So we're sort of, I guess you get these breezes by the lakes and stuff like that. It kind of helps take the edge off a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. Springtime all summer long. This is an interesting, maybe we should bring that one back too. I don't know. We'll be right back.
At Primrose, our balanced learning approach means exploring academic skills and life skills, combining purposeful play with nurturing guidance from teachers, and setting children up for success in future classrooms. Learn more at primroseschools.com/Twin Cities.
And we're back. So, all right, this 10,000 lakes thing, it's in these newspaper ads. And then how does it kind of get formalized? Because, I mean, eventually we're going to get into some, like, this is going to become part of our identity. But, like, how does this get to snowball into something bigger?
Yeah, that same year it goes statewide.
So it's like 1917?
Yep. In 1917, a resort owner and a state senator from Walker formed something called the 10,000 Lakes of Minnesota Association. And then they take marketing Minnesota to the rest of the country and use lakes as our calling card.
Okay, interesting. And so how did this become so, like, officially a part of the state's identity?
In 1950, it landed on our license plates, and it's been there ever since.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. When you were working on this and I was sort of poking around, it was just interesting to see, like, what do states want to say about themselves on their license plate? And, like, as you said, Wisconsin, America's Dairyland. Like, I think they've got a lock on that. Like, I wouldn't even argue with them at all about that. So 10,000 lakes, they were a little bit off. They didn't have all the tech that we have today to figure this out. Because as we said, it's more than 14,000. What's the deal with this 10-acre standard that Minnesota has? I mean, like, how can we, because part of this question is saying that Wisconsin is wrong, but we also said that there is no federal standard. So what's the argument that 10 acres is a good standard for what a lake is?
I had the same question. So I talked with John Downing. He's a professor of biology at the University of Minnesota in Duluth. And he also directs the water science grant program called Minnesota Sea Grant. He's what's called a limnologist, a lake scientist.
A lake scientist.
Yes. Okay. And he said it's a size cutoff, but it has to do with the character of the body of water. Mm-hmm. So you think of a pond, it's mucky, you might have like weeds and cattails by the shore. A lake.
Mucky meaning that like it's muddy or like I can't really walk into it very easily.
Yeah, the water quality is
sort of stagnant.
Yeah. It's not clear. It's not a lake. You don't want to go swimming. Mm-hmm. And the reason that this happens is that a body of water needs to be a certain size in order to create what Downing called a wave-swept shore. This is how he explained it. If you have winds of 35 miles an hour going across the lake, you need to have it be, and you're imagining sort of a roundish lake, it needs to be 10 acres in area in order to get the kinds of waves that will give you that wave-swept shore.
And who cares if there's a wave-swept shore?
If it doesn't have one, it's not a lake. That's what he said.
But I mean, like, what is it about these waves that is so significant?
It moves the sediment and creates clearer water, a different character, and turns it into a lake.
So so when you walk into a lake and maybe there's like a fine sand or rocks or something like that, but something you can walk on. It's not just mud.
Yes.
That's a reflection of those waves that are like kind of keeping that as a clean area and what have you.
Exactly.
Okay. That seems like a pretty good argument to me. And as you noted, like with no federal standard, Wisconsin is counting smaller lakes. I mean, how small are some of the lakes in their count to get to this 15,000 number that they talk about?
They counted bodies of water as small as 2.2 acres in area, so very tiny.
Okay, so we're counting 10 acres, they're counting 2.2 acres. Now, it might seem like we're just like pulling this controversy out of thin air, but I mean, I think when you were working on this, I kept thinking like, wasn't there something about this? And there was. This came up a number of years ago. What was the controversy? What happened? So
Wisconsin's tourism secretary went on the radio and claimed that her state has more lakes than Minnesota. And then she said, "We win. We win."
Wow. Okay.
Yes. And a website called PolitiFact decided to see if her claim had any merit. And they analyzed federal data using that 10-acre standard and found that no, she was wrong.
Okay.
Yeah, they took her down.
This all seems compelling. I mean, we have the word pond for a reason, right? It's for smaller things and lakes. I think this windswept shore makes a lot of sense to me. But we should end on sort of a unifying note. I mean, so you spoke to Downing, and he sort of talked about how Minnesota and Wisconsin are unique in a sense.
Yes. He said that we are some of the more lacustrine places in the world. That means lakey. And it changes the character of the land here. Our forests work differently. The weather is different. It's a draw for tourists. And we should just both be proud of what we have.
Okay. And I would just point out, we did a past Curious story about why Minnesota has so many lakes, which gets into, glacial activity and geology and all these things. So I'll link to that in the show notes because it's fascinating. And I'm sure part of that applies similarly to Wisconsin, which is why this whole phenomenon has happened. So, well, Erica, thank you so much. Any kind of border rivalry thing is interesting. And it's summertime, so what a perfect combo for this story here.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Okay, that's it for today's show. Another reminder to check out StarTribune.com to see all these new things that are happening here at the Minnesota Star Tribune. And if you're not already a digital subscriber, you can get a subscription at StarTribune.com/subscribe. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. Got feedback for us or a question you'd like us to answer? Send us a note at curious@StarTribune.com. And if you're enjoying this show, please tell a friend about it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.